Hello and welcome to our look ahead to what the papers will bring us in the morning. With me are Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer, and Martin Bentham, Home Affairs Editor at the London Evening Standard. Welcome to both of you. A look at those front pages for you, first of all. Most of them are in. We're going to start with the Metro. It says UK officials are to stop attending most EU meetings within 10 days as they focus instead on preparations for Brexit. The same story makes the front page of The Telegraph, which says that British officials will only go to meetings that affect the UK's key interests as the deadline for leaving the EU approaches. The Express is also reporting that UK officials are to pull out of those EU meetings, but it also carries a picture of Jed Foster, who's accused of murdering PC Andrew Harper. The Guardian leads on the EU pushing back against Boris Johnson's attempts to drop the Irish backstop. The Times is saying that Mr Johnson will insist that Parliament can't stop the UK leaving the EU without a deal on the 31st of October when he meets the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And a different story in the Financial Times, it leads on the resignation of Italy's Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte after he lashed out at his coalition partner Matteo Salvini. So a varied set of front pages. Brexit, funnily enough, dominates. Let's start with the Telegraph. Sonia, take us to where they're focusing on this breaking of ties in 10 days.
Absolutely. So the angle that they've taken is they've clearly been briefings that British officials are not going to be attending a certain number of EU meetings in September and October. And actually in the detail of the story, we learned that it's about 2/3 of meetings that will be happening with the EU in September and October. So there will British officials will still be going to meetings in certain areas that are considered to be strategically important, like defence, like security, like budgetary issues, but there'll be a number of other meetings and subject areas where officials won't go. And I think you sort of read this story and think it comes across very much as Boris Johnson trying to signal to the country something rather than to the EU that something is happening. We're taking action here. We might not be able to leave the EU on September the 1st, but hey, I'm going to withdraw EU officials from meetings. And to me, it seems a little self-defeating. You never know what might come up at these meetings. We've got the right to a seat at the table. There could be valuable intelligence, actually, in terms of the negotiations that we're conducting with the EU. So to me, it seems this is mostly about domestic signalling rather than anything strategic. And if anything, I think it's going to make conversations more difficult with the EU when Boris Johnson is asking for something quite difficult from them. Because it makes us look a little petulant.
Martin, what do you make of it?
Well, I think if it is a sort of a petulant thing, then it's not a sensible thing to have done. I'm not absolutely convinced that the EU will be that bothered about it, in the sense of, on one level, they probably don't want us interfering in decisions that are going to affect the EU going forward if we're not going to be part of it. So from that point of view, it sort of makes sense, and it also makes sense to an extent in that Steve Barclay, the Brexit Secretary, is saying, well, it frees up the officials to get on with other preparations and dealing with the world that comes after and so on. So if that's the motivation, then maybe there's a sensible reason for it. I agree with you entirely. If it's driven by a sort of petty signalling motive, then I think that's a mistake. So we have to sort of see, don't we? But
I suppose if you're going to leave an organisation on the 31st of October and you want everybody to be clear that that's definitely going to happen, it makes sense to start severing those ties, doesn't it?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think it is mostly about sending a signal. It's not about sort of practicalities. And actually, there's a very good argument that, you know, every politician that supports Brexit tells us we still want to maintain close links with the EU after we leave. So why would you withdraw officials from meetings a couple of months early and miss out potentially on some valuable information? It just kind of doesn't make sense to me.
I'm going to risk this word because I mentioned it to you both, that apparently Mr Johnson has invented a word called a backstop-ectomy.
Yes.
It doesn't sound pleasant, does it?
It doesn't, no. Well,
that is what he wants to perform, apparently.
Exactly.
According to what he told ITV News. This is his, you know, the backstop will be no longer.
Yeah, well, the process isn't going to be pleasant either, is it? And already we're still having this standoff about the backstop going on. And it appears so far that Boris Johnson hasn't got very far Today, the EU seems to be standing by its original position that the backstop has to stay, and that actually the current deal is the deal, and so on. Now, obviously, that may change, but that's how we stand.
That rather naturally takes us to the Guardian. I mean, interesting, isn't it, to compare the take of the Telegraph and the Guardian. The Telegraph goes big on this, in 10 days' time, these meetings will no longer matter. The Guardian heads rather more towards what the EU is thinking about this backstop plan, and at the moment they don't like it.
Well, that is the fundamental thing, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, whether we getting that addressed in some shape or form does seem to be necessary. I mean, the fact is, of course, on one level, the EU is playing quite a hardball game with us over this and saying Boris Johnson hasn't come up with a practical solution to it. On the other hand, if the EU wants to avoid no deal, and they are actually saying this is the only deal that they're offering, which is what they've been saying so far, then the question is, how on earth is that going to get through Parliament? Because actually it isn't. There are some Brexiteers who didn't vote for it, but the Labour Party didn't vote for this deal. It hasn't gone through Parliament, and in fact, Boris Johnson finally did vote for it. So that question still remains to be asked. So there needs to be some flexibility because it's not going to go through Parliament unless actually, it's funny enough, the Labour Party suddenly turned around and voted for it, because of course that would take it through, because there'd be enough.
There's an interesting line, isn't there, in the first paragraph of this Guardian piece. EU in a coordinated response that appears to close the door on a restart to meaningful Brexit negotiations. This idea that they've somehow sort of collectively got together, as they have tended to be so far, united, and coordinated their response to say, this is just not going to work.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a surprise really to any sort of watchers of Brussels. I think the mood music has been quite clear and unambiguous. Apparently there are a few people in Brussels who sort of looked at the letter and thought at the letter that Boris Johnson sent to EU leaders and thought that it may have been meant in good faith. Maybe there is a little bit of wriggle room here, but the overwhelming sense in Brussels is the backstop itself was a big compromise. It's an insurance policy. Obviously, we all want to find other solutions to having no border in Ireland that will get rid of the need for the backstop, but it's our insurance policy. And that was already a compromise, and we're not going to budge from it. And I think most people in the EU saw that letter from Boris Johnson last night and interpreted it as Boris Johnson essentially gearing up for no deal, asking for something that he knows is going to be impossible. So we're essentially in a standoff, and it's a case of who's going to blink first.
But it is right also to say that what they're saying is also appears to be impossible, i.e. the deal that's been put forward previously and is the current deal. There isn't a way that appears possible to get that through Parliament. And so even if Boris Johnson was willing to try to put that back to Parliament, then it's not obvious how on earth, without some change to it, because...
But Boris Johnson isn't asking for some change. He's now asking for it to be removed altogether, which is a pretty extreme position.
I know, but it's the crucial thing that's been stopping the deal going through, isn't it? So you can see why he is asking for that, and of course there can be some finessing. But if you just stick to the line that actually there's no way forward other than accepting the deal that's on the table now, and that's the only option, there's no renegotiation, no reopening of it, full stop, then there's obviously a problem. So what the Guardian here is talking about, and other papers also clearly, Boris is going over to talk to Angela Merkel President Macron, then to the G7.
Yep.
And I suppose the hope is, I think on all sides actually, that there is some breakthrough one way or another, some flexibility, and that this united front that's being presented at the moment does give a little bit, and there's some ground.
Well, that's what I was going to ask as a final thought on this. Do either of you give any credibility to the argument that we are currently at I was going to say at an early stage of this? We're clearly not. But here we are with what looks like a new government here, to all intents and purposes. And obviously the EU has been pretty settled in where it stands. Are we looking at the start of the end of the process whereby both sides play hardball now, but in a few weeks' time, we just start to see a little bit of wriggling?
It's quite hard to see where the wiggle room comes in from where I'm looking at it, I suppose, because I think what the EU would say is that we have to have some ground rules, and one of those is protecting the sanctity of the single market. So that's why if you want to avoid a border on the island of Ireland, there has to be a degree of regulatory alignment between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And you sort of got to respect the EU in that sense. I mean, they do have a single market. There are borders. You can't just sort of say to countries you can get privileged access to this without any sort of regulatory alignment at all. So I think it's very hard. I think the EU, as it stands, are probably more willing, perhaps, to countenance a no-deal outcome and more ready for it than the UK are. And that's what this is going to come down to.
I'm not sure that's the case at all, really. In that, I mean, it may end up by default, and we could end up actually both sides' official position is they don't want no deal, of course, and clearly the danger is that despite everybody saying that, we end up with one because nobody can quite find a way to find any route to a deal. But I'm certainly not sure that the EU is just ready for no deal in quite this way, and that somehow, because it's going to have very big consequences. Yeah, it may have great consequences for us, and I don't dispute that, but it will have consequences certainly for Ireland, and that's the paradoxical thing is by sticking firm to this, they'll end up with what they say they absolutely don't want, potentially.
Should we talk about something else?
Let's.
Martin, on the front of The Guardian as well, pollution linked to mental illnesses. This appears in the Telegraph as well, I think, doesn't it?
It's a very interesting study, which is basically saying, well, here it says research published in found that children in the US and Denmark, or people in the US and Denmark, there's a link between air pollution and an increased risk of mental health problems, including bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and personality disorders. From what we can see, it looks like a correlation without a definitive causal link, and obviously there would be factors. The most polluted areas are often those with the highest levels of deprivation and all sorts of other social problems, which clearly are potential causes of some of the mental health problems which talks about here.
Yeah, you were having that conversation outside about how reliable this is.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect, I mean, it's a huge study, so it draws on the US aspect of the study, draws on the health insurance records of 151 million health insurance records, and then there was a secondary aspect to the study that looked at data from 1.4 million people in Denmark, and you would expect scientists on a study of this size to be controlling for lots of things like deprivation, poverty, other lifestyle factors, for example, like drinking. So I imagine this is fairly robust in showing that there is correlation between air pollution and mental health outcomes, isolating those two factors. But I think Martin's absolutely right. There's a question about what is that causal pathway, and there's a hint of it in the Telegraph piece, actually. Apparently experts think that it's a complex interplay of genetics, neurochemicals and social factors. So, and it's quite significant figures that we're talking about here. So Americans living in the most highly polluted areas were at 27% increased risk of being diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So they're not insignificant figures at all. And
obviously what it does do is we know there are other serious health consequences living in polluted areas. So this appears to be another one if there is a causal link. And actually, and also, even if there isn't, clearly there are sufficient other problems that are caused by pollution to be doing something about it if we possibly can.
On the front of the Daily Mail, Sonia, they have an exclusive about Boris Johnson's partner, who, the headline speaks for itself, barred from America.
Well, it's quite the scoop in the Daily Mail, actually. So apparently what's happened is that Carrie Simons, Boris Johnson's partner, she works for an environmental group that's based in the US. Apparently she applied for a visa to go over there as part of her job, and the US authorities, immigration authorities, have blocked the request. Now, what we don't quite know from this story was whether this was an official who kind of who went through this and blocked it, whether it was an
automated thing. It might just be computer says no.
Might be computer says no. It's thought to be linked to a 5-day visit that she made to Somaliland last year. But I think whatever it is, there's no question that this is really quite embarrassing for the Americans. I mean, to say no to the partner of an ally coming into your country on a work trip is not a great mechanism.
I wonder if any phone calls are about to be made.
I suspect it'll be resolved. I think what it is probably is exactly that. It's an automated process. And I went to Iraq a year ago, and when you go to Iraq, you can't go to your US on a normal ESTA visa. You've got to have a 10-year visa. So I immediately went and got a new visa in case I wanted to go for that reason. And obviously Somaliland would fall into the same sort of category as a place like that, because it's got problems of Somalia, Somaliland, problems of international terrorism affecting them potentially. So I think that's just the country that she's been to. Not for those purposes. Obviously, she went actually with the FGM campaigner Nimco Ali, so it was for a very sensible, worthwhile purpose. But clearly, the country involved is one that would flag up, I think, on the US immigration systems.
We're going to try and squeeze two more into our last minute and a half or so. Private schools enter weak students as external candidates to, quote, manipulate league tables. This is from the Telegraph. Sonia, what do we make of this?
So apparently what's been happening is obviously a lot of pressure on schools, state schools, private schools to do well in league tables. And apparently some private schools, and I'm not sure it's something that's whether state comprehensives are able to do actually, but this is an issue that the Telegraph have identified in the private sector, but they're forcing pupils at their schools to register for the exams as external candidates, which means that their results don't count for the schools towards the school's results. And I mean, it just sounds like a sort of terrible way of gaming the system.
And when the pupil finds out, they're presumably less than impressed.
Well, it is an absolutely terrible thing, isn't it? We have had this sort of thing happening certainly with grammar schools in the state system, of when they've done their GCSEs, then stopping them go on to do their A-levels because they haven't got sufficiently good grades and so on. So that's happened in the state sector in some schools, certainly, and this is exactly the same type of problem. That where's the duty of care to these children who've gone through their education? They may not be quite as bright as the most outstanding person, but that doesn't mean to say that they aren't deserving of being entered and treated properly and so on. And so, hopefully, actually, any school that's doing this will be exposed, and other parents might think twice about sending their children there and hit them where it hurts.
All this, of course, as thousands of students, as the paper points out, prepare to pick up their GCSE results tomorrow. A final word, at least this time round. Martin, this is also from the Telegraph. Well-off teens twice as likely to drink alcohol.
Yeah, well, this is quite interesting because this theory has been around before, hasn't it? That of course, if you offer your children a glass of wine or whatever it might be, and allow them to drink and gradually ease them in,
they'll become a responsible.
That's the theory, isn't it? But actually, this is suggesting that doesn't actually necessarily work. And I have seen this sort of conclusion before, that in fact, by introducing them to alcohol at that stage, then they end up being more prone to drinking. So, well, it's certainly something to think about, isn't it, for people who think that that's the right way to go, and it also gives the lie perhaps to this idea that the people who are out there getting boozed up and behaving badly are all from a sort of a less elevated background, which is certainly not the case necessarily.
On that note, time is up this time round. Thank you both very much for the time being. That's it for the papers this hour. Sonia and Martin back at 11:30 for another look at the papers. So thank you both for now. And next on BBC News, time for the weather.